In CAT 2022, slot 1 was the toughest VARC section that we had. In that slot, this was a relatively easier RC and the one which you can solve quickly with 100% accuracy if you follow the techniques that we've learned in our lesson and what we practice in the classes. So as always, let's look at the questions first to get a sense of whether we have more direct or inferential questions, which will help us understand how we should read the passage. Now the first question. Which one of the following statements does not correctly express the similarity between the ice grand shine and the Cathedral of Freiburg Minster? Names not very important usually, but in this case, of course, we've got to pay attention. Now here, the question is which of the following does not express correctly? That means that 3 of these options have a correct similarity between the shrine and this Freiburg Minster, and whichever is not the right similarity will become an answer. Now, this could be something which we find throughout the passage or perhaps just in 1 or 2 paragraphs. If we are going to get it in 1 or 2 paragraphs in one place, we'll attempt to immediately solve it as soon as we have read about these. The second question is an inferential question. Which one of the following scenarios is unlikely to follow from the arguments in the passage? Again, this means that 3 of these are things which are true based on what's given in the passage. Whichever is not becomes our answer. But since it's referring to the arguments in the passage, it makes sense to read the entire passage, understand the author's viewpoint, and then use that to quickly find the one which doesn't follow or eliminate the 3 which do. This is again an inferential question. Based on the passage, which one of the following copies would a Chinese museum be unlikely to consider as having less value than the original? Again, you can see that they followed the similar strategy as what they did throughout CAT 22, where they've made the questions a tad confusing. So instead of just saying that a Chinese museum would consider as having the same value, they've inverted it and said unlikely to consider as having less value. So double negative, unlikely and less value, essentially it becomes which one of these would have the same value as the original. So probably once we understand the philosophy of Chinese museums or maybe, philosophy of the Chinese overall, then we can solve this question. Because it's an inferential question, we can also solve it at the end. This is a meaning question. We have a phrase which is given to us from the passage. We can see that from the quotes. An unassailable original. The value that the modern West assigns to an unassailable original has resulted in all the following except. So the West gives value to something which is an unassailable original. It is probably 100% original. It's not something whose originality can be denied. But again, without speculating on the meaning now, we'll of course understand it from the context when we go through the passage. Even if you don't know the meaning of the word, probably going through the passage and the relevant paragraphs will help us to solve this answer. So we'll try and do it that way. So now let's go through the passage. The Chinese have 2 different concepts of a copy. So there are 2 different types of copies that they have. I'm just going to read this as Fang. I would definitely suggest you don't spend a lot of time in memorizing foreign names. Names and numbers are things that we don't need to focus unless we specifically have something in a question. So now let's just call it Fang for short. They are imitations where the difference from the original is obvious. These are small models or copies that can be purchased in a museum shop, for example. The second concept for a copy is Fushipin. They are exact reproductions of the original, which for the Chinese are of equal value to the original. So the Chinese have 2 different concepts of a copy. Now, this is of course really important because it's the first paragraph, it's giving us the context. And we also have a question about a Chinese museum. So let's just note this down. There are 2 types of copies that they have in China. One is the Fang Shipin or whatever, which is essentially an obvious copy, and then you have the other type, the Fushipin. Again, I'm just writing FU, maybe we'll write FUZ here, which is of equal value as the original. So the Fushipin are exact reproductions of the original, which are of equal value to the original. It has absolutely no negative connotations. So it's the same or equal to the original, and there are no negative connotations at all. There's nothing negative that, oh, this is a copy, it's a duplicate or anything like that. The discrepancy with regard to the understanding of what a copy is has often led to misunderstandings and arguments between China and Western museums. The Chinese often send copies abroad instead of originals in the firm belief that they're not essentially different from the originals. The rejection that then comes from the Western museums is perceived by the Chinese as an insult. So for the Chinese, there are the obvious copies and there are the copies which are exactly the same as the original. They're considered to have equal value as the original and there's no negative connotation. Now, as a result of this, there is an effect which could sometimes happen, which is if some of these copies are sent to Western countries, maybe, to European museums or American museums, they would not be okay with the copies. So for the Chinese, that is like an insult. So the other thing which we can note down as a contrast is that when it comes to the West, for them, a copy is a copy. It is different from the original. The Far Eastern notion of identity is also very confusing to the Western observer. So the Far Eastern, now we've expanded from China to some other perhaps Oriental countries. So let's understand why their concept of identity is also confusing. The Ice Grand Shrine in Japan is 1300 years old for the millions of Japanese people who go there on pilgrimage every year. But in reality, this temple complex is completely rebuilt from scratch every year. Now, this is important because we do have this question. So let's understand this well. So this shrine is there in Japan. For the Japanese, from their perspective, it's 1300 years old. But the reality is that this complex is rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. So now we can understand why it's confusing, right? So even perhaps from our perspective, if something has been rebuilt in the last 20 years, we look at it as something which is relatively new. But from the perspective of the Japanese, probably because they have a similar ideology, they are looking at it as the age-old temple which was there. So now we have understood about the shrine. Let's keep reading and see if we are getting the cathedral also and something which is there right in the next paragraph. The Cathedral of Freiburg Minster in southwest Germany is covered in scaffolding almost all year round. Scaffolding is nothing but the support structure that we have when we are constructing buildings or repairing them. If you don't understand it, no problem. The rest of it will help you understand. The sandstone from which it is built is a very soft, porous material that does not withstand natural erosion by rain and wind. So it's basically made of sandstone which is quite fragile and after a while it crumbles. As a result, the cathedral is continually being examined for damage and eroded stones are replaced. Now look at the difference, right? This one is rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. This one, as and when there is some damage to the stones which are fragile, they are replaced. And in the cathedral's dedicated workshop, copies of the damaged sandstone figures are constantly being produced. So anytime any stone has to be replaced, there is a copy which is produced and that is put in its place, but this is more like repair. It's not being rebuilt out of choice. Of course, attempts are made to preserve the stones from the Middle Ages for as long as possible, but at some point they too are removed and replaced with new stones. So a lot of times what can happen is that these stones are not the stones which are as old as the cathedral, but these are newer stones or younger stones, if I can put it like that. Fundamentally, this is the same operation as the Japanese shrine. Now, this is important because this, of course, is the author's view. Fundamentally, this is the same operation as with the Japanese shrine, except in this case, the production of a replica takes place very slowly and over long periods of time. So, the only difference is that this one is happening once every 20 years and this one is continuous, right? So essentially, we've understood the difference in the philosophy or the perspective that we have in the East and in the West, in the Far East, right? Where for the Easterners, there are some copies which are exactly the same as the originals and then they are having the same value. For example, this Ice Grand Shrine, they consider it to be 1300 years old, even though it is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. Whereas this cathedral in Germany, that is something which is being repaired as and when it is needed. But fundamentally, it's the same thing, except that it is happening slowly. So whenever one stone needs to be replaced, that gets done, then another, and so on. And eventually, it's going to be rebuilt of all new materials because at some point, they cannot keep preserving the middle-aged stones. After a point when all of them are damaged, they are replaced with new stones. So now that we've understood this, let's look for something which is not a similarity. Now, both are continually undergoing restoration. This is already wrong because we've discussed that this temple complex is rebuilt once every 20 years. This is the one which is continuously happening. It is covered in scaffolding almost all year round, right? The authors, to help us, actually made it quite clear over here that in this case, which is in the case of the German cathedral, the replica takes place very slowly over long periods of time. So this effectively we can say that, it's continuous. Maybe today there's some damage, then next week, then next month, and so on. But the Japanese one is not damaged. The shrine would have been built 20 years back, and then it will be built after 20 years, and so on. So this is probably the correct choice. But let's also validate that the other three are definitely similarities, because our question is which does not correctly express the similarity. Both can be regarded as very old structures. Yes, here there's obviously a little bit of an opinion. It is the Japanese who are considering the shrine to be old. And similarly, the cathedral, of course, it's something which is from the Middle Ages. So again, a few hundred years old. So this is a similarity. We can eliminate it. Both were built as places of worship. This, from a vocabulary perspective, also we can understand. One is a shrine, one is a cathedral, which is nothing but a large church. So as long as we know that, that is sufficient. Both will one day be completely rebuilt. This is something which we need to infer. Now, the Japanese one, we've been very clearly told that every 20 years it is rebuilt. So we know that, the Japanese one is going to be rebuilt as soon as 20 years are done. Now, when it comes to this particular cathedral, this will essentially be rebuilt once all of its stones have been repaired. Now, once all its stones have been repaired, what essentially happens is that, they are replaced with new stones which are not from the Middle Ages, and ultimately it will be completely rebuilt. It will just happen over a very long time. So this is also a similarity. In the cathedral bit, you might have to just think and infer this, and the first option becomes the correct choice here. Now at this point, we can also try our hand with the third question. Which one of the following copies would a Chinese museum be unlikely to consider as having less value than the original? Or a better way, an easier way to say it, a more direct way, would be a Chinese museum would consider as having the same value. So remember that we've already studied that the few shipment are exact reproductions and have equal value. So as long as it is the exact copy, that would be considered as having the same value. So now, considering the options, Pablo Picasso's painting of Vincent van Gogh's original painting, identical in every aspect. The moment it is identical in every respect, it becomes this second type. So that's an exact reproduction, and that has equal value, which is what we have written here as well. So this should be the right answer. This will be the one that you can look at it this way. The museum is likely to consider as having the same value as the original. So this should be correct, but let's just validate the other three options. Picasso's photograph of Van Gogh's original painting printed to exactly the same scale. Now, this is identical in every aspect. It's a painting. It's a painting which is a copy of a painting. Here it's a photograph which is a copy of the painting. So there is one difference. So we can eliminate this. In the same way, looking at option 3, this is a miniaturized painting. So the difference is in the size. It's a smaller scale. So this again can be eliminated. This is in fact similar to the Fang type models, which are small models of copies which don't have the same value. So we can eliminate this as well. Picasso's painting, here the difference is bearing Picasso's signature. So there is one extra element added over here, which again means that it's not an exact replica. So we can eliminate this because option 1 is better than all of these three. All these three have some or the other change, whether it is the medium or the size or added details. So option 1 becomes the correct answer here. Now you can see we've gone halfway through the passage and we're done with a couple of questions. And if we do it this way, it becomes much easier. Next, the author tells us, in the field of art as well, the idea of an unassailable original, very important because we have this question. So the idea of an unassailable original developed historically in the Western world. Back in the 17th century in the West, excavated artworks from antiquity, so any artworks from the past which were brought out, they were treated quite differently from today. They were not restored in a way that was faithful to the original. Instead, there was massive intervention in these works, changing their appearance. So, at least till the 17th century, people in the West would change any artwork which was found from the past. It's only now that they have the concept of an unassailable original. Now, it's definitely easier to understand if you know that unassailable means, something which cannot be attacked in any way. But we can also infer it because we know Earlier, what they used to do was they were treating it quite differently. They were making changes. There was massive intervention. So that means that an unassailable original should be the opposite of this, which means that the restoration should be exact, there shouldn't be any intervention, and so on. So now based on that, let's see if we are able to solve this question. Since the next paragraph is not related to art, it's speaking about cloning, we've been told here that this unassailable original is something which is developed in the field of art. So I think we should have got all the information which we need and we can try solving this question. The value that the modern West assigns to an unassailable original has resulted in all the following except. So that means three of these are an impact of this value for an unassailable original, something which is not a copy, not an obvious copy, or not even like, a copy of the original, the way they gave the example, Picasso copying Van Gogh's painting. So it allows regular employment for certain craftsmen. This is something which makes sense because they want to make sure that the copy is as close to the original as possible. There'll be some restoration because of damage, and probably that is why the craftsmen are essentially employed. So this makes sense. This should ideally not be the answer because we are looking for something which is not a result of this. It discourages them from making interventions in ancient art. This is definitely a result. Earlier, they used to make interventions, but now they have stopped and now they're giving a lot of value to something which is exactly as it was before. It discourages them from simultaneous displays of multiple copies of a painting. Again, if one is an original, the others are copies. So you can't have multiple copies. Ideally, you want to have just the original. So we can infer that these three are effects or impacts that come up when you give importance to an unassailable original. It discourages them from carrying out human cloning. Now, this is what I call an out of scope answer. If you've gone through the elimination module in our RC lesson, then you will have this. Remember that an unassailable original is something which is only there in the field of art, right? While it might have led to something elsewhere, here the value that they assign to an unassailable original has to be related to art itself. So this would be something which would essentially be out of scope. We can also mark it to be the answer confidently because we know that the other three are definitely possible. We need craftsmen for restoring it in the exact way, right? Certain craftsmen, nobody making any changes or interventions. They don't make interventions and probably they don't go with multiple copies. Human cloning, it could be something. It's also in a way a copy, and we learn more about it in the next paragraph. We've already seen that. But if you treat this as a direct single question, even though it's an elimination one, and you look at it only in the field of art, it's easy to get the right answer and not be confused. And that is why solving a question, if we do it immediately as soon as we've read the relevant parts, that actually ends up increasing our accuracy. It is probably this intellectual position that explains why Asians have far fewer scruples about cloning than Europeans. The South Korean cloning researcher, again name not super important, who attracted worldwide attention with his cloning experiments is a Buddhist. If you see, I just went over the name and the year. We don't really need it. We are looking at this context of how copies and originals in the world of art could have also influenced the perspectives when it comes to cloning, which is making an exact genetic copy of a human or any other living being. So this researcher is a Buddhist. He found a great deal of support and followers among Buddhists while Christians called for a ban on human cloning. So Buddhists were fine with cloning, but Christians weren't. He legitimized his cloning experiments with his religious affiliation. I am Buddhist and I have no philosophical problem with cloning. As you know, the basis of Buddhism is that life is recycled through reincarnation. So this is something which typically in India we know the concept well. The soul comes again and so on. Even if we don't understand it, we can always link it to the copy and say that, okay, Buddhism is probably okay with making copies, whereas Christianity isn't. In some ways, I think therapeutic cloning restarts the circle of life. So in certain cultures, because they don't look at a copy as being different from the original, or they don't, if it's exact, they think that it has the same value, probably cloning is also something which they are okay with. So that's broadly it for this RC itself. What we've understood is the difference in perspective when it comes to those in the Far East and those in the West. Westerners used to make massive interventions till the 17th century at least. It's only now that they look at these unassailable originals. Whereas the Chinese or the Japanese, for them, an obvious copy is a copy. But if there's something which is an exact replication of the original, then it has a similar value. So now let's solve the last question. Which one of the following scenarios is unlikely to follow from the arguments in the passage? So what is not in line with what the authors told us, which is essentially this difference in perspectives. Now, if you read the options, you see that the first and the third options, they are the exact opposites. Both are set in the 17th century. From our perspective, a British painter and a French artist, both would essentially be considered as Western. We have not looked at people from different European countries in the passage. We're looking at Eastern and Western, right? So both are similar. There are some additional details who adhere to a Christian worldview and all, probably words from the passage just to confuse us. But the primary difference is the British painter would have no problem adding personal touches, whereas the French artist will be completely true to the original. Now remember, back in the 17th century, which is your 1601 to 1700, be that AD, excavated artworks were treated quite differently from today. They were not restored in a way that was faithful to the original. Instead, there was massive intervention. So the British painter not having any issues in adding personal touches is actually something which is following, whereas the French artist being completely true, just because he's a Christian or she's a Christian doesn't make any difference, right? It's about the philosophy itself. So this is something which is unlikely to follow from the passage. Let's quickly look at the other two options to be sure as well. A 21st century Christian scientist is likely to oppose cloning because of his philosophical orientation. This is also fine. We know that Christians actually called for a ban on human cloning, right? So this is something which makes sense from a philosophical standpoint. Again, here philosophy, we have to look at it from a religious perspective. This is something which is fine. So this also we can eliminate. It's in line with the author's arguments. And a 20th century Japanese Buddhist monk would value a reconstructed shrine as the original. Pretty easy. We already know that this is something which is happening. So this again is in line with the passage, and we go with the third option over here, which is not following. So tactically, especially if you're pressed for time, what you can do is when you have two options which are very similar except are the opposite or different in one aspect, if only one of them is given in the passage, that becomes an easy way for you to select it. So that's all for this RC, and I'll see you in the next one.